Hello, I'm Glenn Fay, Research Fellow here at the Centre for Independent Studies. Our schools are responsible for more than just teaching children to read and write. They're a place where social capabilities are nurtured, values are formed, and where students build the resilience for success into adulthood. We often hear schools, universities and other public institutions are focused on cushioning, not challenging children. The result? Childhood free from challenge and disappointment, leaving students without resilience, tolerance and other virtues needed to cope with the harsh realities of life. To discuss these issues and more, I'm pleased to welcome back to the CIS two exceptional guests. Baroness Fox of Buckley, Claire Fox, is Director and Founder of the Academy of Ideas and a former member of the European Parliament. In her book, I Find That Offensive, she examines the causes and consequences of what she calls Generation Snowflake. Claire, thanks for joining us from London.
Delighted to be with you.
And Dr. Tanveer Ahmed is a psychiatrist, author and columnist for the Australian Financial Review, where he writes on social issues. His book, Fragile Nation, looked at the growing construction of vulnerability. He treats adolescents, has served on local government and advised governments on immigration and cohesion. Hi Tanveer, thanks for joining us in Sydney.
Pleasure to be with you, Glenn.
Claire, Tanveer, welcome back to the CIS. It's really great to have you both here for this important discussion and I think really timely for where we're at in the COVID journey, both Australia and the UK. Claire, to kick us off, I want to get some definitions out of the way. You talk a lot about the phenomenon of a generation of snowflakes. Now, what is it that would make somebody a snowflake and how would I know that I've met them?
It's sadly become a term of derogatory abuse in a way that has become a cliche, which is unhelpful. But I think that when it first emerged, particularly in America around campus culture and what was happening at universities, it denoted a generation who were particularly thin-skinned about what they found to be offensive and were reacting against ideas and language that they said hurt them. And the sort of notion of the snowflake was that this psychological hurt caused by words and ideas would make them react in a negative way to the usual robust challenge of debate and discussion. That's effectively it. There's one other slight aspect of it, which is it's in some ways it implies an enfeebled focus on their own vulnerability. So something Tanveer is familiar with, and that's what they stress. But it also takes a rather aggressive form, because if you don't respect that vulnerability and show due deference to it, then you'll find quite an aggressive reaction back. So it's a kind of notion of weakness that takes the form of demanding that you recognize their weakness or else, and then you are actually a victim of their attempts to cancel you often.
Tanveer, is this phenomenon of snowflakes really a new thing? Don't we already have a framework of pathologies to make sense of the issues we're talking about?
Look, I guess we can frame it in the sense that I guess every generation raises various concerns about those below them. But I think statistically, I guess one of the big questions, certainly in my profession, is there actual statistical and hard data suggesting there is something going on that is unique or a bit different amongst this generation? When we say this generation, we're probably looking at those probably just slightly younger than millennials. That's probably the group we're looking for, probably in their teens and 20s now. And I guess what's especially concerning to even sort of hard-nosed professionals without necessarily any sort of ideological bent is that statistics do seem to suggest there is an increase in certain presentations. Really, the last decade and a half, we see clear increases in things like self-harm, eating disorders, and I guess the broad terms around depression, anxiety, which are very broad categories. And they're pretty difficult to refute. So they certainly raise questions.
Can I take that for a minute there, that idea of subjectivity and the harm principle? Claire, surely the subjectivity that Tanveer is alluding to, surely that's a corruption of what Mill was talking to in the justification of the harm principle.
It absolutely is, but it sums up in some ways things that have changed. And the one thing to clarify is that whilst we are describing something called Generation Snowflake, that term that's used. And there is a generational shift because it's a different concept of what, for example, the transition into adulthood would mean, which has become ever later in young people's experience, but also, for example, those people who leave home and go to university historically might have seen themselves setting out on a great adventure that's associated with experimentation, with risk-taking, with, pushing boundaries. I mean, all those things that we think of young 18, 19-year-olds. It is remarkable that one of the phenomena of young 18, 19-year-olds leaving home and going to college is that the first thing they demand is that the authorities protect them, and that they're kept safe. And this is not something you associate with kind of young, lively, going out there and changing the world type people, pushing boundaries. So there's a shift there from generationally. But I think the problem is that a lot of these concepts of safetyism, of a stress on vulnerability, of the social valorization of victimhood, are actually an adult phenomena. I mean, they're a social, cultural phenomena, which in many ways we have socialized young people, but into that rather than into maybe some of the other things which were previously considered virtues that you discussed at the beginning, Glenn. So that's interesting. So the point then about the harm principle is that it's not surprising in that context of safety first, above all else, that you would look to see harm everywhere you go. And harm has become expanded as a category in a way that Tanveer has described. I mean, I think one of the things that's most extraordinary, because I started off many, many years ago as a mental health social worker, and there was always great concern about the idea of a stigma if you were labelled mentally ill. If you were diagnosed, not labelled, diagnosed mental illness. What's phenomenal at the moment is that from very early on in school, but certainly something we're seeing in further and higher education, are young people demanding that they're given the label of mental health. I mean, that self-description of mental health problems associated with leaving home is enormous. So people subjectively say, if I go to that lecture, or if I'm exposed to these ideas, or just generally I'm not coping well with, being lonely because I've left home, or exams, or stress, the stresses of everyday life, they will describe that in the pathologized language of the therapeutic language of psychiatric harm. I mean, the reality is that, young people have been saying, eccentric things forever. When I was a teenager, I demanded all sorts of things of adults. I demanded all sorts of outrageous, you must give me a higher mark. You don't understand my viewpoint. I demand that you do this. And they would look me in the eye and say, go away. You don't know what you're talking about. I've got experience and I do know what I'm talking about. They would assert their authority in the face of the demands that those of us would make, or many of us would make. Today, the institutions collapse in the face of this. So the students or the young people demand something, and instead of everybody going, don't worry, you're a teenager, you'll get over it, don't panic, immediately the institution says, how can we reorganize the whole of our institution around your demands? And that is one of the reasons why it's become a free speech phenomenon, just finally, because when somebody says, we demand that that speaker is not allowed here because they will trigger PTSD and harm young people psychologically if they are exposed to that idea, the institution doesn't say, this is a university, this is where you must be robust and have debate. They say, oh, absolutely, we agree with you, we'll ban that speaker.
Tanveer, education seems to me to be a site where the harm principle is especially misapplied. But surely it's not really harm when we're talking about children having to get constructive feedback on schoolwork, or being graded academically, or possibly being ranked amongst their peers, or having to meet difficult deadlines. Is this an overextension of harm?
Well, you would think so. I mean, that is a big change. It's certainly not just in schools. I mean, it's something you see in the workplaces as well. So how to give feedback, what might be acceptable there. And to some extent, there are bigger sort of cultural trends there. I mean, probably half a century ago, almost teaching by leadership by humiliation or something along those lines, embarrassment, was probably more acceptable. You know, for example, in the military and certainly we're in parts of medicine and many sort of more traditional disciplines. So I think it's a flow on from that, where the line between that and where now it has to be kind of constant partnership and almost even more than partnership, a lot of accommodation of juniors' needs and aspirations, especially as work and to a lesser extent even school becomes, if you think of a broader sort of life's project being about self-fulfillment, then sort of every space of life, whether it be school or the workplace or the university, becomes an extension of that. You know, becomes, well, this is another place for me to fulfill myself. You know, that's a sort of cultural trend. And when that's not playing out as upcoming generations may not want, it raises these concerns. You're like, well, hang on, what's going on? So again, it overlaps with suddenly the measure of psychological harm being different, the subjective nature of it. So suddenly if I'm upset by some sort of feedback, the onus isn't necessarily on me, as I think we would have previously thought, and most people I think still do. The onus isn't necessarily me to go, okay, it is naturally upsetting, but I can use that as motivation. Now there's a tendency for at least a portion of people, and possibly a growing minority of people, to go, well, actually that's not acceptable. It's not acceptable you give me that kind of feedback or push me in a way that I feel especially distressed or potentially, again, that term, harmed. That's become a real sort of forte. And again, it overlaps a lot with particularly specific groups, all these interactions. If you're deemed a part of a pained group, and Claire alluded that the proclamation of pain in some way now it confers status to some extent. But it only does so in certain groups. It doesn't necessarily easily work for all groups. You know, if you're a white male, for example, it's not quite as easy to proclaim pain and have it accepted. And she's also right. I think Claire's also right about the changing nature of. I just want to add a note about adolescence here, Glenn. Look, the very notion of adolescence is probably barely 100 years old. Like it's, you know, in the past, you know, you basically went straight into the hunter-gatherer work if you're a male, or, you know, soon after puberty, you were having children. So the very notion of adolescence is relatively new. But biologically, it is actually supported because our brains, especially as parts of our brain, like the frontal lobe, which often deals with judgment, impulse control, doesn't fully develop till you're 25. And neuroscience has only shown that in the last 30, 40 years. So actuaries in insurance companies arguably knew it before because they could see it through the insurance premiums. So there is some authority to the notion of adolescence. And one of the key aspects of adolescence is separation and independence from your parents, particularly your mum, which we'd call it the key attachment figure psychologically. And then it's all about forming groups and feeling like you belong in groups. So that sort of tribal identity is so critical. And in terms of feeling self-conscious about not belonging, that's most paramount in adolescence. So part of the question here, if we're raising questions about whether something's changed about this generation, is has social media, has the smartphone, has that changed something about the nature of belonging and how adolescents belong? And certainly one aspect of the internet that Claire alluded to, like for example, in self-harm, I have patients who are exactly on some of these self-harm groups. And certainly the internet can normalize pathological behaviors. I mean, you could be a terrorist, you could be a pedophile, you could be a self-harmer, and you can join groups where it's normalized. Instead of you being the only one in the playground, there's 300 people around the world who are doing that, and suddenly it doesn't feel terribly abnormal. And that can be empowering for many people, but it can also magnify whole sets of problems. Likewise, in things like bullying, In the past, it might have been one or two people in the playground that you felt bullied by. Now you go home and suddenly there's 35 messages on your Snapchat account or whatever it is. So that's where social media can magnify both the positive and negative. And I might just allude to a question. I noticed a question there. Someone, it's obvious, one of the biggest names in some of these studies are people like Jonathan Haidt, Jean Twenge, and a lot of them, they study data. So they're not necessarily clinicians as such. So they look at whole swaths of data, and they've certainly made a link with the smartphone, not necessarily as a direct cause. And clinically, we don't necessarily see a direct cause. Most patients you see, healthy people can use smartphone and social media in healthy ways, and it often just adds to the nature of their personality. But likewise, if you're especially socially anxious, you're far more sensitive to seeing things on social media that then make you more upset. It might highlight whatever you feel inadequate about. Likewise, some of these notions of self-harm or bullying. So certainly what we see clinically, what I would say clinically, is that technology and self-harm have the potential to magnify those who are already vulnerable. But I think there's something in adolescents, because they're so sensitive to group identity, belonging, yet their brains aren't entirely developed, that the internet and social media corrupts some of their vulnerabilities. It seems to potentially magnify some of the vulnerabilities and poke at them in relatively unique ways that I think may be a key contributor here.
Claire, Tanveer's highlighted the issue of bullying, and you're quite famous or infamous for recognising the importance of bullying in the foundation for some social formations. Is the anti-bullying movement an example of good intentions gone wrong?
Yeah, well, first of all, even to describe it as a movement is an indication of what's happened is that it's been galvanizing ahead of steam. So rather than it being a discrete description of something quite specific, it became almost a movement. And I would argue now as an industry. And there's a huge swathe of anti-bullying organisations throughout the world, but I'm obviously more familiar with the UK. And one of the things that you will have noticed, we also used to confine the term bullying to children, and it was something we associated with school. But actually, Tanveer just talked about what's happening in the workplace. I mean, there's so much now discourse around bullying at work, but bullying is now, you hear it in political discussion, that's bullying. When somebody's having a robust exchange in Parliament, somebody says, "Don't you try and bully me." So this word has escaped the confines of the school very much so. But within schools itself, however, again, we associated historically bullying with particularly, usually, physical harm, people getting their heads kicked in, but extreme harassment, teasing, pointing at someone, not, identifying someone, consistently demeaning them, humiliating them physically and otherwise. And we're all familiar with it. Some of us have been bullied. We've all, had kids who were bullied, and you just it's a horrible thing. It's the worst of child cruelty. That's the way to describe it. And we know that children's insensitivities know no bounds very often, and it can be very hard. And you often famous people will come out of it and say, there's so many famous people who say I was bullied at school, because this is not to make a virtue of something that's so unpleasant, but often the coping with bullying is one of the things which can mark you out in terms of character formation, which is not to say it's a good thing. It's just that it indicates that people who've gone through it, you really have to dig deep to get through it. Now, bullying is almost anything and everything. I mean, that's the formal descriptions of it are, everything from it's one-off, it can be just name calling, it can be exclusion from friendship group is the one that particularly gets me, because obviously the whole process of growing up is that you are either included or excluded in friendship groups. The idea of compulsory friendship is so authoritarian, it's frightening, but this is almost the idea that, if you decide that you don't want to be friends with someone, you don't invite them to the pictures one night, then you're going to be accused of bullying. And this actually is genuinely what happens. And in fact, I think in my book, I tell the story of my niece. She wasn't pleased, by the way, that I did this. But that when she came back and said she was being bullied, we were absolutely distraught. And then we found out that there was 2 girls hadn't invited to the pictures. And when we kind of tried to explain and put in perspective that this was not really bullying, she was all right, she was going to cope, she kind of, rather haughtily held up the school anti-bullying policy and said, no, you're wrong, it is bullying, and so on and so forth. But the problem with the way that bullying is discussed is not only is it expanded in its descriptions, and therefore young kids very early on are told that it's bullying if you are called a name or any one-off instance like this. So that's the way we introduce them to this idea of themselves as being vulnerable and victims. But we then say that if you're bullied, it will destroy your life. It will have everlasting impact. So all the anti-bullying agencies say we need to be able to tackle bullying, because if a child is bullied, they will end up more likely to have mental health problems, drug addiction, criminal behavior, all these terrible things, which of course then makes young people even more worried, because if you're fatalistically told that if you have unpleasant messages on social media, that is going to destroy your life, that in a way adds to your anxiety. And it does snowball then into a phenomenon where, rather than us being able to reassure the young that this is something that they can cope with, that indeed sticks and stones might break your bones, but words will never hurt you. This, by my very saying this, consigns me to being a generation, of dinosaurs. But that notion of reassuring the young that they will overcome is now replaced by any child that's been bullied needs official intervention, needs official protection, and will be damaged if we let it go on challenged. And that's really difficult. And I suppose I wanted to emphasize something. I just referred to my dinosaur tendencies. One of the things that has changed, it seems to me, is that we have, as a society, become alienated from the past and from past tradition and past cultural norms in a way that adults are very keen to say, what do we know in an ever-changing world? We've talked about social media. In an ever-changing world, actually, we as adults really are out of date. We're not really with it. We don't really understand the young and what they go through. Adults will say to the young, you are going through more suffering than any previous generation. So forget world wars, forget children being forced to work, forget these things. Social media bullying is the worst thing that anyone has ever gone through, ever, right? That's what adults think. And they also feel politically that they're not up to date with different social groups, and they almost take on board, oh my God, our generations didn't understand. We had no sensitivity to issues around racism or sexism or misogyny, despite the fact that, in fact, those older generations are the people who fought for civil liberties and created women's liberation. But, oh no, that doesn't count. But it's this disavowal of the past that somehow the young understand more than we do, that has given rise to a situation where the young are almost abandoned by adults, but accommodated to at the same time. And so we are oversensitive to the idea that the young understand more than we do, and partly it's a way of us disavowing the social and cultural norms that we were reared on. Now, I think that throws out virtues that are hugely important, and that we're abdicating responsibility for passing on those virtues and introducing those young people to those virtues, because we've lost confidence about whether they're virtuous anymore. So things like the stiff upper lip, as it was known in the UK, the notion of coping, of tolerance, but also of resilience, these things are considered to be out of date. And therefore, we're abandoning the young by not showing them how to deploy and develop those virtues. And that, therefore, sadly, leaves them vulnerable. So I think it's a betrayal of the young by our generation and so on, rather than that the young themselves have kind of emerged with these kind of mad attitudes. They didn't come from nowhere, they came from us.
I'd like to stay on the issue of intervention a little bit more. Tanveer, in terms of bullying, of course, is one example of this, where the heightened attention toward bullying seemingly has created its own demand. Is this also not true for a lot of the other mental health pathologies and needs? It seems to me that the more we've heightened awareness around the issues, seemingly for very good intentions, seems to have just simply created an endless cycle of demand. Have I got that right?
Yeah, I think there's absolute truth in that, Glenn. I mean, I often do sort of workers' comp, bullying, racism type complaints in the workplace. And one rule of that is whenever an organisation pays for, say, consultants to do an anti-bullying program, within the next 6 months, there's usually a big spike in bullying complaints, right? You can bet on that. And I think that can be seen as a broad trend. And I think part of it is, people get sensitised to the notion of it. So they're looking at it, sort of looking for racism under the bed, if you like, a bit like that. Also, I think it narrows the language. So people call things bullying that are not bullying. So it becomes an ever expanding term. But it's also used as a weapon. That's the other thing. So remember, in many of these things, especially bullying, in many workplaces, it's become a weapon to use in the various games. Going back to adolescence, one of the key skills is learning the games of dominance, hierarchy, and I'd bring a gender dimension here too. The reality is males, statistically, are far more overt in how they may display that. Whereas we're talking about exclusion, the fact is females are more likely to use gossip or exclusion as some of their key weapons. So part of me does wonder, while there's certainly generational differences, certainly in middle-aged women versus millennial women, part of me does wonder if some of what the trends we're seeing is partly as more and more women move into positions of power in traditional sort of male domains, whether some of these types of tensions that we're seeing partly have a strong gender component. Because you certainly see that a lot in medicine, where some of the big bust-ups, and likewise in the corporate sphere and elsewhere, some of the big bust-ups, and obviously, most dramatically things like Me Too, etc. But it's much broader than that. They often do have this misinterpretation on dimension that does have a gender component. So part of me does wonder if that's a factor too. But even when I'm assessing, increasingly bullying is used as a weapon against your enemies in the workplace. And likewise, when you feel mistreated in some form, you get the classic one in some of the ones I assess, you get a negative performance review. Suddenly there's a bullying complaint. And that's a very common scenario. And the law has even incorporated that, knowing that that's such a common way of coming back. And even at an industrial level, it's interesting in this space, so many things that might have gone through the industrial space, for example, like I wasn't getting paid enough or these kind of things, suddenly it's like that is not as acceptable. It doesn't have the same legitimacy. And it goes back to what Claire was saying. There's a lot more, unless you're hurt, unless you're psychologically damaged, whatever's happened to you doesn't carry legitimacy, I think, in the culture. And that's another reason why a lot of this terminology, we've created this time, you might not get paid enough, but rather than you going to the union, you'll lodge a psychological claim that you're upset about it. So I think that says something about what's acceptable, what's given legitimacy, what's given status in the current culture. And we certainly see that even at the highest levels, a lot of celebrities, etc. Your experience is given more status if you incorporate the mental health component. But not only it is given more status, you can also avoid a degree of scrutiny. So it has so many different angles, the way mental health is used now. It's used as a weapon. It's used as a way to prevent scrutiny. It's used as a way to compete for status. So it suddenly has so many different dimensions in terms of its utility.
Can we stay on that for a second, and this issue of victimhood and mental health being used as a, I suppose, weapon and shield in both cases? The high-profile case in recent times was Simone Biles in the Olympics, Naomi Osaka, other prominent competitors and that have used the platform to raise awareness about mental health, but in seemingly a different tone. It seems to me, Tanveer, that the effort has been very much on not so much focusing on the overcoming of the adversity, but on sharing the nature and the experience of the mental health concerns that they're addressing. Is this a similar type of phenomenon? Is there something different in the way that these experiences are shared?
The Simone Biles one was especially interesting, wasn't it? Because she was black, she was such a massive figure in the US. So it was very interesting to see how different parts of the media handled that. And while it wasn't something I looked at in great depth, I was fascinated, say The Guardian covered it in a certain way where her mental health and her withdrawal from the Olympics was covered in a way that was part of a broader sweep of sort of black oppression, and suddenly it had overlaps with the identity politics. So that's an example of where if you're from a certain identity group, your psychological pain has a much broader political dimension. Not only are you suffering, but your suffering says a lot more about the external world than your internal world, right? So this is a big fault line in the politics, where how much of it is related to your internal world, related to your early life development, your immediate family environment, etc. Whereas it increasingly, if you're from a certain group, any psychological distress you feel must automatically imply that the external world must be modified to kind of accommodate your suffering. So Simone Biles partly was seen in that respect, but I did see it certainly covered that in a much more practical industry context of what's changed about modern sport, what are the demands they feel, modern media, the dimensions of that. And that's, look, I accept that to some degree, but I think the other dimension is it is increasingly the way if you fall down or if you're not able to cope, but you want to avoid the scrutiny, this is a way of saying, okay, look, this is something I want to do, but I really don't want you to ask me about it or question me about it, or I don't want to be scrutinized about it. And this has become quite a typical way of potentially doing that. And it happens, it's usually the most highest profile, whether it's Prince William or Naomi Osaka or Simone Biles, it has become almost a script now for a famous person or celebrity to try and couch or to cushion what's potentially a PR disaster or a professional failure.
Mm. Claire, let's put that same victimhood weaponry into a more political context. Is victimhood mentality? No, I mean, it seems to me this is used as a censorious club more than anything. To prevent full and open discussion on things. Am I right to be that cynical about the deployment of victimhood mentality?
I don't think you're wrong at all. I don't even think it's cynical, but I don't know that people use it quite. I mean, some people are opportunists and use it cynically, but it's become what's just been described as part of the script. So, how you fight politically is to do this. I kind of made the point that when somebody says the phrase, I find that offensive, they're not just telling you that. They're basically saying, I find that offensive means shut up, right? And then, of course, you add in things like, as a woman, I find that offensive. As as a person of colour, I find that offensive. As a disabled person, I find that offensive, and so on and so forth. And then you kind of say, as a disabled person of colour, as part of the LGBTQ community, I mean, kind of like you're adding on your victim points, and there is this sense of victim Olympics, as we've just been talking about the Olympics, but where you're competing with how many victim points you can accrue, because that does give you a pass and gives you some kind of special status, and you're meant to, because of the notion of lived experience, and these are where these things start to corrode it and be so corrosive of politics, which is lived experience and your innate characteristics or your identity characteristics are meant to speak for themselves and to be the last word so the notions of reason and objectivity and enlightenment ideals around, analysis and so on are completely dismissed and usurped and trumped by who says it. And therefore it becomes important that you are a who and that you've got something to say. And it was already referred to that, if you're a white man, you're in quite a tricky situation. But of course, then you will see white men, as it happens, trying to think of their own, first of all, if I'm a white gay man, that's okay. But then you might say that a white heterosexual man who's kind of like deemed to be the worst oppressor start to say, well, the way I'll fight this is by saying, well, I was bullied when I was a child, or actually I've got psychological problems, I've got mental health problems. So actually everybody's playing this game. That's one thing. And it is difficult because, political oppression is a serious matter, but we have historically understood it in the modern era as the denial of democratic rights to groups who are oppressed because of innate characteristics, right? So racism, which is a form of political oppression, is the denial of democratic rights and equality to people because of the color of their skin. And this is atrocious. But it's not atrocious, not a moralistic, but, and people fought for equality and equal rights. Women were treated as lesser and second-class citizens and, not capable of reason, for example, and the kind of people who had to be treated separately. And women fought for equality. As it happens, historically, the working class were treated as inferior, almost animalistic, and just incapable of understanding. And we fought for universal suffrage, etc., etc. Now, the way that you fight politically is not for those political rights of equality, but actually that you demand recognition of your difference. Often the form of suffering is deemed to be is described in therapeutic language. So one of the things I was going to say was that in the argument around statues in America and the UK, but again familiar more with it here, in Oriel College where we had the Rhodes statue issue, you would get people who would say, black students who would say, walking past that statue was a psychological attack on me, akin to my forebears who were slaves. And obviously you think, no, it wasn't. What are you talking about, right? Being a slave and walking as a highly privileged student at Oxford University, walk past a statue is not the same. But they would say it causes I have a psychological link with my ancestors, and I feel their pain through that statue. And you cannot challenge that because the physical act of the physical act of being a slave that's owned and beaten and demeaned and denied agency is now given a link with today's sensibilities through a psychological web of meaning. So history is completely destroyed in that discussion, but it's also impossible to challenge because they will say, I feel it as though I were my ancestor. Even in fact, it wasn't their ancestor at all, by the way, but that's neither here nor there either, because now you have given yourself ancestors through a group, through joining a group. So the reason I'm saying that is I don't think that those young people are being cynical. And in fact, they've got to the point where they do feel some pain when they walk past a statue, but you do want to say, don't, because it's a bloody statue and it's not the same as being a slave. But you can't challenge it because it's subjective. And because the subjective lived experience, and the lived experience now is not just where you can say my lived experience is and describe the physical life that you have, but your lived experience is also in your head. So you can never challenge that. And if you were to say, no, this is objectively a ridiculous comparison, they would say that you were denying their lived experience and you were therefore part of the racist narrative that dominates them and causes them so much pain. And so we go on. So one feels in the middle of a nightmare. Somebody's just put up here that these things are used by grifters, and I want to challenge that. There is a small minority of people who exploit this in a way that, you know, often can accrue them money or fame or what have you. But to see it as something that people do, this is it's the wrong approach. So many of our young people believe this to be true, and they are not challenged by society. So you cannot blame that. You know, they're not just doing it because they're grifted. I just can't stand that concept, because it just assumes people do it for money. It's just a sort of bad faith thing. I think the worst and most depressing thing is that people believe this in good faith. They believe it in good faith, and those people in political positions of political and cultural power, all of us, do not challenge them enough. There is not enough challenge, because we're frightened that if we do, that we will pay the consequences, because what we haven't discussed is that there is consequences, and that's what we now broadly describe as cancel culture. Because if you challenge some of these things, I'm regularly called an apologist for bullying who wants young people to suffer, you know, apologist for racism because I won't go along with this particular form of narrative. I'm accused of internal misogyny because I don't think that playing the victim card as a woman is an appropriate way of fighting for equality, and so on and so forth. So, and of course, to be labelled a bigot, to be labelled a white supremacist, to be labelled these things is career destroying for many, many people. And we see that happen. And we haven't even touched on the gender wars, the rows about trans issues. And I barely mention them here because I know, of course, this is enough to get you cancelled by saying the words. But, you know, daily in this country, the Prussian Olympics has now meant that there's a civil war within feminism in the UK, which is that feminists who would normally be victim feminists who would disagree with me are now the subject of cancel culture because they're accused of transphobia, because they're accused of psychologically damaging people who are trans because they will not accept what they are demanded that they accept, which is that a trans woman is a biological woman and you are not allowed to challenge that.
We might have to keep the gender wars for a future discussion, I suspect. But look, Tanveer, we're talking here about the implications toward politics, that spillover from the observations that we've made throughout the conversation. In your view, what are the implications for young people from having that sanitized experience of not being exposed to difference of opinion? What does that mean for young people entering the world where they're going to be faced with differences of opinion? They're going to be faced with adversity. What does it mean for them?
Glenn, actually, one thing that I feel like we haven't discussed but is important, especially in an Australian context, and it overlapped with your question about the bullying programs, anti-bullying programs, is the rise of the well-being complex within schools in particular. And that has a strong overlap with what you're saying, where increasingly public schools across Australia, and possibly especially New South Wales, and Mark Latham is someone who's attacked this very, very strongly, where increasingly you have programs where students are asked to constantly monitor their well-being, and as well as parents as well. And then they bring in all these outside consultants. There's things like the Resilience Donut and various other kind of odd programs that are bringing in. And there may be value in this, but there's very little evidence that there is. And it's just it's more evidence that schools where increasingly, despite there being very little evidence that they can actually add value to this, and yet it's taking away from, it's a furphy. It's almost taking the focus of the fact that they're increasingly not performing their key duties in results, in doing well in the basics, be it numeracy and literacy. And the broader political context, going back to your question, is the rise of the therapeutic state, whether it be in schools, workplaces too. There's increasingly thing that, okay, even an employer is somehow responsible for a person's happiness. however that may be defined. So there is this, and there's almost a totalitarian component to that thou must be happy, and it's the state's role to make sure that that's the case. So back generationally, the key vulnerabilities are, and certainly a heightened sensitivity, and not only a heightened sensitivity, it's a inability to be contemplative and self-reflective about that, and consider that perhaps some of your heightened sensitivities may have more to do with your own vulnerabilities. And it's not the outside world that must be modified to accommodate your emotional distress that you're feeling. So that's a key implication. And rather than, there's a few questions there about institution, and I completely agree. You have a lot of weak institutions thinking they need to modify to accommodate what I think is often a minority who are especially loud and proclaim their sensitivities or victimhood. And they think the outside world is what needs to be transformed. And it's not necessarily, look, I'm not saying that there are political movements and things to modify, but I think often in this case, it often has more to do with their internal world. But the more we built up a generation that lacks a self-reflection in a way, and thinks the cause of any distress is outside, that's hugely damaging and constantly demands external transformation, which is hugely disruptive.
But doesn't this spill over into the kind of politics that young people seem attracted to? If a lot of the politics that young people seem attracted to are those of catastrophizing elements, things like climate change and so on, and also things that are largely beyond an individual's control, that they are some external force that's very difficult to change, systemic racism and the like. What is it? Is there a link here in terms of the discussion we're having now and the attraction to those sorts of politics? Tanveer?
Look, I think absolutely. One of the biggest gaps in Western societies is collective identity. So in the backdrop of this is the weakening of national identity, the weakening of communal structures, be it religion, family, clan, tradition, all of those things. And going back to adolescence, Claire and I both mentioned self-harm. And one of the interesting things I find about self-harm is that the fact it's such a common initiation ritual of adolescence in so many traditional cultures. And I think that's fascinating. Self-harm is a very common initiation ritual in a host of traditional cultures, whether it's the Aborigines or Amazonian, you name it. So it's fascinating that it's a pointer that Western adolescence, even though it's this time of transition from child to adulthood, we lack formal rituals to do that often. So it's a pointer that we've lost all these things around, be it tradition and ritual, clans, religion, you name it, all of these sort of things. So obviously there's that broader sweep that there's a much bigger gap in, and it's not a surprise that there'll be movements that are filling that gap. And, often social justice has been compared to religion. I think all young people, look, I think every generation of young people have longed for some sort of revolution, right? So that's, it's a generational kind of tension through any sort of group. So even if by objective measures, people live in the most peaceful, prosperous society in the history of man, yet there may well be this component, and Claire alluded to, be it virtues or tradition or past. There is a spiritual dimension that comes with great prosperity, and whether the pandemics magnified that search, if perhaps less so in Australia, but maybe more so in parts like UK and the US. But there's no question that things like, climate change has been, parody being called sort of religion for rich white people, for example. And, so certainly it overlaps with some elements for that. When you don't have traditions to lean onto or broad stories, if you don't have other collective stories to latch onto or feel proud of. It's interesting to say Harry Potter is really the modern Bible for this generation, especially for girls, instead of the Bible. I mean, and Harry Potter borrows from, traditions, some story, there's overlaps with biblical myths. So there's no question that be it climate change, has the element of doom and catastrophe, apocalypse, and things you must do. In the meantime, there's sinners. So those worlds are obviously being built in new ways, and it's very important to both identify and poke holes when they potentially cause enormous damage.
Claire, it's not that young people aren't involved in politics, right? Is it something different about the kind of activism and political engagement that's different in this generation? I know that in your past you've been a revolutionary Marxist, so it's not that they haven't had social justice movements in the past. Is there something different this time around, or is it something that we should expect as a recurring generational theme?
I only wish that they were revolutionary Marxists, let me tell you, because what's lacking from today's politics is the concept of agency and responsibility. And what we're talking about in relation to identity politics is to make a virtue of not what your achievements are, but who you are, and to focus on yourself in a narcissistic way and almost to deny agency. And one of the aspects of politics today, and young people just express it better, but I often think they're ventriloquizing older generations' prejudices. This is what I keep trying to emphasize. They exhibit what we've taught them. I mean, they're not even revolutionary in that sense. And as previous generations will know, what's creative is that young people historically kick against the pricks, as the phrase goes. You kick against the old guard, right? And but the old guard then kind of fights back, and one way or another, you have this kind of shift because you start to work out who you are in relation to what you're, as the older people won't give in. You have a fight. That's how change happens. Now, young people rebel, actually often following the script laid down by their elders, but they rebel and they kick against an open door. And so they say, we demand this, and they go, oh, okay, then you can have it, right? That's not very creative at all, right? So it doesn't allow any nuance to emerge. So that's another problem. But you talked about why are people attracted to catastrophism? And you're in Australia in the middle of the coronavirus pandemic, and no disrespect, but Generation Snowflake have not created the reaction of the Australian government and authorities to this, right? And we can see, therefore, that the trend towards saying safety must trump liberty has deeper roots, and our generation has somehow not fought strongly enough for liberty as a foundational virtue that we have in so many ways internationally in the Western world completely, in my opinion, overreacted to the pandemic. I don't deny it remotely that there's a pandemic, and this virus scared the hell out of all of us, right? And we didn't know whether we were facing our version of Camus' The Plague, and nobody wanted to be complacent, and public health measures were absolutely required. However, politically and conceptually, people have become terrified in a way that it's going to change, it looks like, social norms for many generations. And that is disproportionate to what we're dealing with in terms of a public health challenge. So that's an adult way of dealing with things. And the point of my book was to say safetyism is what we socialize the young into, and they then find their ways of expressing it. Vulnerability was the model that we told them that they should aspire to, and they find their ways, and then it comes back to bite us because they then, accuse us of bullying and so on and so forth. But nonetheless, the biggest problem is these concepts, the change in politics more generally. And so climate change, again, is, of course, a practical, technical problem that one needs to deal with. Humanity's impact on the planet has, and the whole process of industrialization and modernity has had an impact on the climate. We need to take this into account. But this is not a millenarian end of, times moment. But of course, it's being treated like that. So catastrophism is exactly what we get. But that's what we get when it comes to, we've just described it, bullying will destroy your life. Everything is millenarian, right? Everything is talked up. And so I think that we cannot be surprised that the young, such as they are, rebellious, join in the extreme versions. They join in the Extinction Rebellion version. I suppose they're in Australia as well, rather than the kind of like, they're not kind of respectable green politicians. They join in the Extinction Rebellion extreme side of it. But that's still not all young people. So the other thing we have to remember is that generationally, these are trends, but it's also true that there are distinctions to be made. There is a real class distinction to be made in the UK. I mean, these are middle-class young people very often who go along with this stuff. And for a lot of working-class young people, they just do not recognise it at all because they've got to earn a living. They just haven't got time for all this self-indulgent stuff, yeah? So there are differences even amongst the generations. And I'd also like to say that there's starting to be a lot of young people who feel that they're denied agency through this vulnerability narrative. They're smart and they recognize that they've been given a script, and they have some aspiration to go beyond the greatest achievement of their life is to say that they're a victim. They might want to achieve something, and they want to demonstrate that they are able to cope with, and not be a snowflake and not be coddled, to use that phrase. So we have to appeal to them, and we have to have a conversation with them and encourage them to be revolutionaries, the kind I like, the ones who actually want social change and to overturn what are now norms, and the therapeutic side of society, the catastrophizing are norms which we as a generation have created a world of. And I want the young people to rebel against that myself.
Unfortunately, we do have to leave it there. Claire, Tanveer, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Claire. Glenn,
thanks for having me.
Everyone listening.
Yes.
Now, for decades, CIS has been a fiercely independent voice, working tirelessly to deliver evidence-based public policy, especially in the critical area of education. To be notified of our future videos, make sure to subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell. CIS relies solely on the generosity of people like you to help us advance our cause. Check out the links on screen now to see how you can get involved.